who wants to be a developed country. For $1 million, answer this question. What is the best measure of development? A. Money. B. Infrastructure. C. People. If you answered money, you would not be correct. If you answered infrastructure, correct would not be you. But if you said people, you are a genius. And maybe you'll soon be a millionaire. Because people really are the best measure of development. And today's podcast will be about education. Education is one of two important systems for human development. Did you know Nigerians are the leading immigrant group by population who have higher education degrees in the United States? By proportion, Nigerians in America have more higher education than their white American hosts. Educated Nigerians are heads of research institutions, universities, hospitals, NASA departments, even White House agencies. Yet, back home, there is little impact of education on Nigeria's institutions. Mediocrity is increasingly normal in our political and public affairs. What causes this difference? A Pan-African historian, Amos Wilson, once said, educated Africans tend to do a better job at fixing European problems instead of our own. Meaning, if your education does not give you the tools to fix your own country, question it. It's also what writer James Baldwin said about the paradox of education, that your education should make you question the society you're in. To kickstart these questions, let's first unpack some myths so we can see our education system better. Recently, I was reading the website of my alma mater, the University of Ibadan, and in the second sentence on the homepage, they mentioned that they were a surrogate of the University of London. It's a thing of pride we've been told since we were children, this special relationship between London and Ibadan. But I have unlearned that pride because I now know that the first universities were in Africa. I now know that the Greeks traveled to Africa to learn what became Greek civilization. And even after that, in the Middle Ages, when the Romans destroyed the first European civilization, it was Africans who returned to Europe for another 700 years to teach them again what we now know as modern civilization. Wait, in fact, let me share 3 short quotes from one of my favorite books on pre-colonial civilizations. Before colonization happened 200 years ago, West Africa was the home of more kingdoms and empires than any comparable region in the world. All these numerous countries, kingdoms, and empires had varying political and social systems. In what is today Nigeria, we could see pre-colonial democracy in action with the first global emergence of electable governors. Advanced political organization was seen here in these parts, as well as ingenious medical practices and technical skills. Should I read more? The West African region was perhaps the most industrious and prosperous region of the time in the world, with the highest concentration of highly developed societies on the continent and quite possibly the whole world. Should I read one more? The 3 largest empires of West Africa created a golden age not seen since the New Kingdom era of Kemet, that is ancient Egypt. And incredible riches and fantastic universities were found there from the 10th to the 16th centuries. I've been reading from a book called The Black Past, a history of African people written by Aaron Smith in 2021. It's a thoroughly researched compendium from 12,000 BC till today, one of my favorite books. These are not standard lessons in the history curriculum. Imagine if we were taught this. Then we wouldn't grow up equating westernization with civilization. Instead, we would learn to look into ourselves and lead ourselves by ourselves for ourselves. As such, any historic association between any Nigerian university and any Western universities that suggests any kind of cherished tradition or hierarchical relationship should not continue to be in the opening paragraphs of our descriptions. It should be somewhere at the bottom, and at the top should be something about ourselves, by ourselves, for ourselves. Let's unpack another myth. I have read and reread documents about the colonial commissions that established the first Nigerian higher institutions, as well as similar educational institutions in colonial India and parts of Latin America. The reality is that it was not in the colonial interest to support the establishment of fully independent educational institutions who could pursue radically different ideologies that could lead those nations away from the West. That's why education was restricted to a minority, and the selected few educated Africans had only one purpose: to relieve Europeans of low and middle level administrative tasks. This would reduce the cost of having European civil servants on African soil and enable continued colonial resource extraction with the least inconvenience to Europe. That's why the number of schools created during the colonial era can be counted on the fingers of both hands. Historian Walter Rodney summarizes it this way: far more universities and schools were built by Africans in the first 10 years after colonization than in all the 100 years that colonizers were resident in our countries. Knowing that should put to rest another big myth that colonizers brought education to Africa. Maybe I can give just 2 examples of Africans doing more than colonizers ever did. On January 18th, 1955, the Western Nigerian government, headed by Chief Obafemi Awolowo, kicked off our free primary education scheme. This was 5 years before we were independent. In just one day, about 400,000 children went to school for the first time. Of these, only 96,000 children had parents who could afford the expenses. If this had been under the colonial administration, they would have remained illiterate because the Europeans claimed good education cannot be free. Instead, the newly independent regional government found innovative ways of leveraging agricultural cooperative financing for free education. Today, we are all beneficiaries, not of anything colonial, but of an early Nigerian idea. Let me give you another example that disrupts our colonial narrative about education. You know this man, the man on Nigeria's old 10 naira note, is Alban Ikoku. He was a pioneer of education laws. Let me give you a little backstory. No Nigerians were allowed in the lawmaking process during colonial legislation. Then, in 1946, after several protests, we forced constitutional changes that allowed more Nigerians, such as Alban Ikoku, to join Europeans in our legislative chambers. Ikoku was nominated to the Eastern Nigerian House of Assembly and later to the Federal Legislative Council and assigned to the Ministry of Education. Ikoku fostered the Legislative Council's acceptance of 44 amendments to various educational ordinances which created our Nigeria Union of Teachers, NUT. But he encountered stubborn resistance through much of the 1950s as the colonial government repeatedly rejected his NUT recommendations for education in Nigeria. It was only after national independence that Ikoku's recommendations became the basis for the education policy of the new nation. See, we had to be independent to get education. Colonizers didn't do anything for us. In fact, while the colonizers set up religious education, Ikoku argued that Africans should have full education. While the colonizers also divided boys from girls, and even had separate schools for Protestants and Catholics, not to mention Muslims, it was Ikoku who argued that Africans should learn together. It was Ikoku who introduced a variety of subjects, including agricultural science, nature study, botany, local crafts, industries, hygiene, sanitation, history, geography, mathematics, English, and music. He was thinking along the lines of what do Africans need to learn to do better the work of building their countries. On the other hand, the Europeans restricted education to typewriting and note-taking so that Africans could serve as their clerks and nothing more. In a paper on Nigerian education amidst rapid change, which he presented on 7 January 1941, Ikoku pointed out that Western education instilled a feeling of inferiority among Africans, and that the European educational system only produces an African who feels superior to his kith and kin, and who literally longs not after righteousness, but after whitishness. In 1962, following up on the developments in our Western region, Ikoku called for an education bill of rights for primary school education to be free nationwide for 6 years. This was accepted by the federal military government after 1976. So those are the small steps that led to the education system that we have now. There is one other myth we can challenge. That is that education can be added on or taught to us. Even the Latin root word that means education literally says we have to extract it outwards from within or draw it out. Think of a sculptor with unfinished clay. Everything is already inside the clay, ready to be molded out. This is in line with some African thought systems like the Yoruba, who say every child is born with an ori, a unique internal attribute waiting to be cultivated. There is education inside all of us, and the best education systems only nurture us until we ourselves bring it out. In the context of the student-teacher relationship, perhaps words like lecturer and lecture should be replaced with educator or mentor, mentorship or coaching. Maybe we can unpack a sixth myth about standardization, about holding all students to the same standard of learning, about the simplistic binary of pass or fail according to one hegemonous teaching method. On the other hand, education psychologists show that there are at least 7 uniquely different types of intelligence. They include spatial, visual, auditory, linguistic, numerical, kinesthetic, and other types of intelligence. All of these are based on different types of brain design. So, every child is born wired to learn differently. In many of our schools, all children are forced through the same mold, without accounting for how differently we are wired to learn. This is one reason why education systems generate so much mental and physical stress. Remember the adage about a fish not being able to climb a tree and therefore thinking it is unintelligent? We can become more open to brain differences and how children learn. Words like neurodivergence, ADHD, autism, and dyslexia now mean more than they used to. Also, the emerging conversation around mental health and childhood trauma should play a role in setting new standards for education. Bullying, intimidation, and repression are school-ground epidemics. Learning cannot take place where there is fear. Instead, what develops is cramming and people-pleasing, and educated people who lack critical thinking skills because they've adapted to survive in cruel learning environments under pressure. We should have zero tolerance and a collective cultural response to the abuse of power in any of our schools, whether among students or from teachers. In conclusion, disrupting education as we know it will cost a lot, financially, materially, and institutionally. But it's better that we do the right thing than to continue churning out graduates who will eventually be lost to brain drain, educated people who cannot transform our own countries. At the entrance of my alma mater, the University of Ibadan, there's a gigantic inscription. It says our graduates must prove competence not only in learning, but in character. In fact, the Yoruba people have a historic constitution. We call it Omoluabi. A properly educated person should be a paragon of character and be productive. We should question why, in spite of modern education and modern religion, we keep moving further and further from our natural values and high social ideals. Maybe it's time to reinvent our approach to education. Education should lead to human development, functioning democracies, strong countries of us, led by us and for us. What do you think about education? Share your thoughts in the comments. Until my next podcast, be sure to hit my follow button and maybe you can be a millionaire where it matters in good ideas.